New York City on the verge of collapse. Housing crisis causing mass homelessness. New York City, the city that never sleeps, is now the city where too many can't find a personal place to rest their heads. In April 2024 alone, 131,940 people slept each night in New York City shelters, of which a whopping 45,061 were children. Compared to April 2019, when that number was just 69,000 in total and 23,000 for kids, the number has doubled and seems to be rising even further. Alright, let's break this down. Imagine if you took the total number of people staying in those shelters, the ones run by the city, churches, and other groups, and multiplied it by like 3 or 4. That's probably closer to the actual number of people dealing with homelessness in New York City. It's mind-boggling, right? We're talking about countless people who are either sleeping rough or crashing on someone else's couch. That classic American dream of homeownership? Yeah, it's becoming a distant memory for a lot of people living here. And I know I'm not the only one seeing this as a major issue. But before we get started, thank you for liking and sharing these videos. It really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss these regular updates. If you've lived in New York all your life, you would be shocked at how so much has changed regarding access to affordable housing. Some people say the only reason folks can afford to live here, even in the cheapest parts of town, is because they bought their places ages ago, and their mortgage is like a walk in the park. On the other hand, you've got people saying only doctors and lawyers can afford these insane rents. Everyone's got their own theory, but there's one thing we can all agree on. New York's housing situation is a total mess, and it's pushing people right onto the streets. So what's really fueling this whole housing mess in New York? Well, a big part of the problem is that they haven't been building enough new homes. Compared to other major cities, New York City and the surrounding areas are way behind. It's like they're playing catch-up, but with one hand tied behind their back. Check this out. From 2017 to 2021, New York City only permitted 13 homes for every 1,000 residents. Meanwhile, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Seattle were way ahead, adding more than twice that number. Even in the New York suburbs, the situation wasn't any better. Nassau and Suffolk counties on Long Island only permitted a combined number of less than 8 homes for 1,000 residents each. In contrast, the Boston suburbs of Middlesex County and Norfolk County added 29 homes combined, and the Washington, D.C. suburbs of Arlington County and Loudoun County added 85 homes per 1,000 residents. If we take the analysis a bit further into the past, say between 2010 and 2019, New York had just 25.3 housing units approved per 1,000 residents, while the likes of San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Antonio, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. had far higher numbers approved. Shockingly, New York's population has grown by 823,147 residents. That's 4.25% between 2010 and 2020. At this point, you're probably wondering why the city is not building more homes, right? I mean, with the increase in population, you'd think they'd be building like crazy. Well, the blame lies on decades of deliberate and unintentional policy choices made by city and state officials. For example, 60% of residential lots fall into the lowest density zoning categories, with a huge chunk of them not allowing single-family homes, despite the need for more apartments to accommodate more people. To make matters worse, the downzoning and contextual rezoning of some areas have further reduced the available land that can be built on. Also, many other possible development sites in areas zoned for high-density buildings are either too small or oddly shaped. Developing these sites would require combining multiple lots or merging zoning lots, which would definitely take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. These are not the only reasons why new houses haven't been built. Check out the cost of actually building something in New York City. It's completely insane. Materials, labor, and everything else are super expensive. So when developers finally do build something, they have to charge a ton of money just to cover their costs. Also, believe it or not, the rules about who's responsible if something goes wrong on a construction site are actually making buildings more expensive. These strict laws mean builders have to spend a lot more on insurance and safety than in other states, as much as 7%. In a way, it's like they're paying a penalty just for wanting to build something. Like a cause and effect situation, when you don't build enough homes and the population keeps growing, you get crazy competition for the few places that are available. This means rents and the cost of houses go through the roof faster than most families can afford. Now, the average rent in New York City is $3,650 per month, which is 70% higher than the national median of $2,149. Meanwhile, the average cost to own a home in New York City was between $776,100 to $825,000. When you take all this into account, the bigger picture is even more shocking. Housing costs in New York City have actually gone up by a whopping 68% in the last decade. That's the biggest jump out of all the major cities in the U.S. These numbers feel huge and scary because despite the average salary in New York City being a hefty $107,000, when you compare that to the cost of rent, it's a whole different story. The average renter here would be shelling out more than 40% of their annual income just on rent before taxes even came out. Amid this housing crisis, real estate corporations have also played a part in fueling things even further. Initially, the rental home market was dominated by public veterans who invested their savings and pensions in buying homes, along with mom-and-pop investors who owned just a property or two. Back then, big firms were more interested in other real estate sectors like office towers, shopping centers, and warehouses. They thought single-family homes were too hard to buy in large numbers and too difficult to manage and maintain. However, after the financial crisis a decade ago, the landscape changed dramatically. Large portions of suburban homes were sold at auctions after millions of Americans defaulted on their mortgages. Large real estate corporations quickly snapped up tens of thousands of these deeply discounted houses, often buying them without even seeing them first. That trend continues even today, and they have devised even more means to own more of such properties since there are only a few foreclosure properties to buy these days. In most cases, they purchase the properties one by one on the open market using a front buyer or even choose to build such homes themselves. Sometimes they even go as far as buying out rivals to increase their own portfolio. Now, it's estimated that by 2030, corporate investors could control up to 40% of single-family rental homes in the U.S. Ordinarily, you might think there's no difference with corporate owners now owning most of the homes in New York City, but that's not true, or rather, that seems not to be the case ever since the influx of these corporate investors into the housing market. Many of the properties they've purchased are quickly restructured into rental units at high prices to maximize profits beyond the previous rents. When this is not the case, the properties are used for short-term rentals instead of regular homes. When this happens, it reduces the available long-term housing. Between 2017 and 2021, properties like this have increased drastically according to the latest housing and vacancy survey conducted by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Now, what happens when one individual, or in this case, corporations, own a lot of properties? The answer isn't far-fetched. With a large share of the housing market, they have more control over rental prices and can easily manipulate the market. When they increase their prices, other landlords are often forced to follow suit to avoid missing out on potential profits. As a result, long-term residents struggle to compete with the higher prices set by these corporate investors. New potential residents, already struggling to make ends meet, find it even harder to afford these pricier rents. Again, the Housing and Vacancy Survey for 2017 to 2021 shows this troubling trend. New York City lost around 96,000 apartments renting for less than $1,500, while gaining 107,000 apartments renting for $2,300 or more. The vacancy rate for units under $1,500 is below 1%, whereas the rate for units renting above $2,300 is 12.64%. Clearly, renters at the lower end of the market are getting squeezed out, while wealthier individuals hold all the purchasing power. We've talked about how there aren't enough homes being built, rents are sky high, and big companies are making it harder for regular people to find a place to live. But there's another huge problem we haven't touched on: the lasting impact of the pandemic. During the early stages of the outbreak, eviction moratoriums were imposed across the country, saving people from being sent to the streets after they lost their jobs due to companies cutting down on the number of workers they need. Now that things are somewhat back to normal, many are still dealing with the mess. Many could not quickly get new jobs, and whatever savings they had piled up prior to the pandemic were used to sustain their household until the COVID restrictions were eased. Hence, once the eviction moratoriums were lifted, there was a wave of evictions as a lot of low-income earners didn't have the means to make rent all through the period of the pandemic and even after. For those who tried to fight through the housing court system to get a respite, many lacked adequate resources to retain legal counsel to defend against eviction proceedings. In many cases, there was little that could be done. Adding to this, other monetary-related COVID-19 relief measures had ended, leaving many without the financial support they desperately needed to get back to stable living conditions. It's easy to think, well, just move into public housing then. But the reality is far more complex. Once a symbol of progress, New York's public housing system has fallen on hard times. Dilapidated buildings, unreliable utilities, and a general sense of neglect have transformed what were once stable homes for families facing housing issues into something entirely different. According to estimations, restoring these buildings to their former glory will require a staggering $40 billion investment, which obviously the government does not plan to shell out anytime soon. Even if one didn't mind living in such conditions, finding a public housing unit is nearly impossible. There's a severe shortage of public affordable housing, with a staggering 32 affordable units available for every 100 extremely low-income households. And the process to secure one of those units is a bureaucratic nightmare with long wait times and limited support. Ultimately, this crisis is forcing people to make incredibly tough decisions, like leaving the city they love just to find somewhere affordable to live. And for those who can't afford any, they have no choice but to make the streets their permanent home. Sadly, the situation may get even worse than this in the near future. Some cities are trying to pass laws that make it illegal to sleep on the streets, even if there's nowhere else for people to go. This is a big deal because it could change how we treat homeless people across the whole country. Right now, there's a rule that says it's cruel and unusual punishment to jail someone for sleeping outside if there's no place for them to stay. But if the Supreme Court changes that, it could mean a lot more people ending up in jail just for being homeless. It's not just about people who've been homeless for a long time. This could affect anyone who suddenly finds themselves without a place to live. And that's a scary, scary thought. This just happened in California. The Supreme Court ruled that cities can fine or arrest unhoused people who lack other shelter and camp in public areas, allowing California and other Western states to more easily clear or ban homeless encampments. Can this housing crisis ever be averted and homelessness reduced? Yes. If the people at the helm of affairs are ready to put in the work, there might be a way out of this housing mess. Other big cities have shown that it's possible to plan for growth despite facing similar issues in New York City. As earlier stated, these other cities are building way more homes. To this end, New York needs a serious plan to figure out how many homes we need, where to put them, how to make it happen, and what kind of homes are needed. Cheap ones, expensive ones, everything. To avoid impeding such plans, zoning laws need to be dealt with too. Basically, there might be a need to tear up the rulebook and start fresh. Right now, the rules make it super hard to build anything new, especially the kind of housing that's needed by the masses who are bearing the brunt of the housing crisis. For example, to increase housing production, future rezonings should allow for gradual increases in density in more residential neighborhoods, including those with mostly single-family homes and those with few development sites. Another major issue to be dealt with is laws that make building in New York City more expensive than other areas. New York City's scaffold law greatly increases the cost of liability insurance for developers and should be adjusted to the comparative liability standard that's in line with the other 49 states in the country. There's also a need to let buildings get taller and bigger in some places. Right now, there's a rule that says buildings can only be so high. If we get rid of that, we can build more homes and still observe all of the possible safety measures. Due to politics, it definitely would take some time before these adjustments can be made. In the meantime, it makes a lot of sense to turn empty office buildings into affordable housing. With many people working from home, there are a lot of empty office spaces, so this is a no-brainer. Policymakers should also realize that housing is a basic necessity. Everyone in New York and across America deserves access to housing so that society can function well. Overall, housing costs need to match incomes, which would make housing both available and affordable.